to have Senator Cantwell wrap this up after her years of leading our committee and being out on the floor, leading America to make sure that we have semiconductors in the United States.
Yeah, make sure you give credit for her big win yesterday.
Huge win. Senator Cantwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing on incentives for affordable housing. And I thank you for your leadership on the legislation that you introduced on the middle housing. Clearly, the 2009 downturn pushed a whole lot of people into different categories, and the consequence of that are still being felt. And so I definitely appreciate your past help and support on the low-income housing tax credit and your legislation, and certainly want to remind people of Senator Hatch when he was with us, was a great leader on this. I always loved that Utah did a Housing First initiative, probably one of the first Housing First initiatives, part of the veterans community there, and showed great success of driving down the cost. If you house people first, you're driving down the cost of that population that we would otherwise have to be seeing impacts from. And certainly want to thank my colleague, Senator Young, for his leadership with us on trying to increase the low-income housing tax credit by 50%. I guess, you know, people don't realize we got a little bump a few years ago, and that expired at the end of last year. So we're actually going to go down in the amount of money that we're putting towards the tax credit. 90% of the affordable housing that gets built with the tax credit. So it really is a governor, if we don't increase it, on solving the problem. I feel like I don't know why we can't get this out there. I just don't understand why. I feel like painting a big supply, message across, maybe one of the avenues out here is just supply, or it's supply stupid, or, I don't know what you get about it. It's really just about supply. And it's so frustrating because there's so many people who've written reports. I could probably get a stack this high of reports saying it's a supply problem. So I would just like to hear from the witnesses why. Why is it that we are not breaking through on the supply message? When you talk about it, it's pretty easy on the demographics. You have elderly people living longer, and that increased the demand. You had returning veterans from the wars, that increased the demand. You have workplace issues like we do in Seattle, that increased the demand. We had a bunch of people fall out of middle income into low income, that increased the demand. I don't get why we can't just admit that we have a supply problem and do something about it. So anybody have an idea why we're not getting this across the goal line?
Well, Senator, I just want to note, and I think you bring up some excellent points. I sit on a board at the Bipartisan Policy Center. They recently conducted a poll that had a very specific question about, do you support increasing the housing tax credit? And it was overwhelmingly bipartisan. It was somewhere like 70% of all Americans support it who were surveyed, 55% of Republicans. So it's a bipartisan issue. I think it is one where you're right. The data overwhelmingly states that it is a problem with housing supply. It's directly tied to affordability. And, it's a variety of challenges. I think the LIHTC is an important step forward, though, in increasing the supply. Everything that you have done and your leadership will be a huge step forward.
Anybody else want to talk about this?
Senator, as an economist, what strikes me as somewhat tragic is that we've had a housing crisis almost for 100 years. The average price of a Midtown Manhattan home in 1929 at today's dollars is $1.2 million. Our housing is expensive to build. There are some efficiency-enhancing reforms we can implement. We can also implement zoning reforms that will make it easier and less costly to build in areas of high demand. And one thing that we've seen evolve over the years is that a growing number of Americans are really focusing on a relatively small number of locations to move to, including Seattle, including the West Coast, including some parts of the Southwest. And sadly, some of those areas, for example, in my home state of California, we make building very, very expensive. In my testimony, I mentioned that one project in San Francisco is costing $1.3 million just to renovate an existing small apartment unit per unit. And when you look at those types of costs, you've got to scratch your head and say, there's got to be a better way. And I think as technologies advance and there's opportunities to increase the use of manufactured homes and change some regulatory requirements, the HUD requirement of a chassis, I think that we have reason to be optimistic if we can make the right choices, and your committee here is very much focused on that, and I'm optimistic then that you can do that, and the future is very bright from that standpoint.
Well, I think we have an inflation problem, and part of it is housing. And if you think about, again, back to this, I like the details, but I think the details are almost irrelevant because they're not totally irrelevant, but if we don't get across this supply issue, if we don't get people to understand that it is a supply issue. Now, yes, can you make it more efficient and affordable? Yes, let's do that. But somehow all that discussion stops people from really understanding that it is a supply crisis. And again, if 90% of the affordable homes are going to be built with a tax credit, then unless we increase the tax credit, we're not going to get out of this. No matter how many people in Seattle pledge to spend millions of dollars on a project, we're not going to get out of this. And so I do think I don't know. I have a suspicion that the derivative market crash has more to do with this. I think it had a chilling effect for several years when we should have realized what the crisis was going to do. My colleague, Senator Bennett, and Senator Brown talked about it a little bit. The crisis made everybody freak out about housing in general because people commoditized or securitized, I should say, some way to make, they thought, more housing supply. And literally it was a house of cards that collapsed. And then people were blaming all sorts of people, and then we did nothing. But at that very moment, we also pushed more people into that demand market because they literally fell out. They fell out of the economy. They literally fell out of the economy. And we didn't do anything to meet demand. So it used to be in this nation that in the 70s or 80s or even 90s, you would hear, housing, let's go housing. Where did that cheer go?
Well, it very much is a supply issue. And to get back to the idea of cost, the more we can reduce costs, just economically, the more we can expand supply. One study in California showed that if California light tech construction costs were not even at the average of other evaluated locations by a GAO study, but were close to that average, California could have built 12,000 more units under light tech funding. So I think until we recognize that our construction costs are remarkably high, it's going to be hard to expand. It's going to be hard to expand supply unless we're really going to push on the subsidy throttle and really, push a lot more dollars into producing what's an expensive commodity and a commodity that.
Well, listen. I met with some people in Seattle who are very charged with this mission. I asked them, and they said, "I think it's going to cost us $15 billion to get out of this problem." I said, $15 billion, like over 10 years? And they said, no, probably over 5. So quantifying how problematic this really is, I'm all for new ideas on how to drive down costs. But, Mr. Cotner, I'm going to give you the last word if there's anything you wanted to add. I saw you had your hand up.
Thank you, Senator. I think your instincts are probably correct after the crash. We underbuilt by about 400,000 houses a year over a 10-year period. There was delayed entry-level market interest because millennials had household formations that were much later in life, and they all hit at the same time. And if you look at the demographics between boomers and millennials, it's significant. So that all hit at the same time when we were building up a deficit just to meet what household formation would be in the future. So I think you're dead on with what you said, and there was a change in the public sector's view of housing, and I agree we haven't had a true housing policy in this country since the 1980s, but the aspiration for single-family home ownership never went away. And that's where all of those things collided, and that's why we have a problem with one group not understanding exactly the significance of the crisis.
I know we have to run to vote, Mr. Chairman, but we shouldn't forget how important homeownership is as economic stabilities for families. And so I hope we can rectify this. I appreciate this hearing, and I appreciate your middle tax policy too. And the chairman and I come from part of the country, the Northwest, who's very plagued. Not that some of you, the Texans and the Californians and others haven't been too, but we have got to step up to this and get some solutions. Thank you, Mr.
Senator
Chairman.
Cantwell,